I dream of a greener future for St. Vincent and the Grenadines, where our country is fully prepared for climate change. A future where we all know our role in protecting our natural environment, where our marine and terrestrial ecosystems are preserved and respected, and where our wildlife are free to exist in their natural habitats. The St. Vincent and the Grenadines Conservation Fund is working towards this dream. Will you join us?
To find out more about the work of the St. Vincent and the Grenadines Conservation Fund and how you and your community can support or apply for a grant, visit their website at www.svgcf.org or call 784-453-1624.
The St. Vincent and the Grenadines Conservation Fund, conservation for a greener future.
Hello. Yes, thanks very much, James, for setting this up. Say good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all. And welcome to all of you joining us for this session on climate finance for resilience. My name is Joth Singh, and I am the Program Manager for Climate Change and the Supporting Ecosystem-Based Adaptation Facility at the CBF. Please allow me to extend condolences to the people of Haiti for the tragedy involving the assassination of the Haitian president and his wife. We stand in solidarity with our Haitian brothers and sisters during this tragic time. Our thoughts and prayers are with you. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to our distinguished panelists for the session. Joining us as panelists are Karen Sack, CEO and President of Ocean Unite, Dr. Orville Gray, who is Regional Manager for the Caribbean and Brazil at the Green Climate Fund, and Jay Kheel, who is Vice President at Grupo Puntacana. The panel is set up in a conversation format, starting with short statements from the panelists, followed by an interactive session through questions and answers. We will also have a question and answer session, and maybe we'll infuse this with the broader question and answer session, where questions would be fielded from the audience. We'll be sharing experiences on the establishment and implementation of financial mechanisms developed for adaptation solutions for climate change. So that, very, very critical subject area with regards to the effects of climate change and financing mechanisms. Just wanted upfront to share with you some logistics information. Just to say that all participants will be muted without a camera. Participants should post questions in the Q&A box, as James mentioned at the beginning, and not in the chat. Please identify yourself by name and country and indicate to whom the question is addressed to. As moderator, I will select audience questions placed in the Q&A box and present them to the panelists identified during the session. Just wanted to let you know as well that translation to Spanish and French is available. So please use the interpreter function button at the bottom of your screen if you need translation. And so that you know the session is also being recorded, so it'll give us the opportunity to broadcast again after this live event. Just to frame it, I know that you will all agree that small island developing states, including Caribbean SIDS, are facing the immense implications of climate change, which requires these states to adapt to the conditions of a changed climate. It's no longer a changing climate. We know that the climate has already changed, and we will feel the implications of that changed climate. One of the major hurdles in this regard is financing the actions which are required. And so this panel was convened to discuss some of the mechanisms which are available, and also to discuss what are some of the considerations going forward. The panelists all represent institutions who are working on innovative climate finance solutions. But before I get to the panelists, I wanted to share some information with you on what the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund is doing in the area of financing and climate change adaptation. One of the two financial instruments operating at the CBF is the ecosystem-based adaptation facility, which is currently a $50 million sinking fund established with funding from the government of Germany through the German Development Bank, or as it's known, KfW. The facility awards grants utilizing a competitive open call for proposals process directly to local, national, and regional projects. Currently, the EBA facility has committed $12 million through 11 grants through our first call for proposals. We have begun signing agreements, and they have already begun that process of completion of signature for another 8 projects from our second call for proposals to approximately $10 million. So that out of that fund, $50 million, we will be committing already, a significant amount of that funding. Wanted to share with you as well that a third call for proposals is planned for August of this year. So those of you interested, please keep an eye out for that. And then we will have a fourth call for proposals, which will be made in 2022. To share with you that the intention within the CBF is to have the EBA facility remain as a permanent feature of the CBF. And we will be seeking additional funding to allow that to happen. And just so that you know, I'd be happy to respond to any questions you may have on the EBA facility. And if you do have questions, please just place them in the Q&A box. So to get ahead with the panel, and without further ado, I will invite the panelists to give their opening statements. I would like to begin with Karen Sack of Ocean Unite. Karen is CEO and president of Ocean Unite, a nonprofit founded in 2015. She's also a co-chair on the Ocean Risk and Resilience Action Alliance, which is a multi-sector collaboration designed to build resilience in the regions and communities most vulnerable to ocean risk by pioneering finance and insurance products that incentivize investment in nature-based solutions. So Karen, if I could ask you to provide a perspective on how financial innovations can build resilience to climate change-related ocean risk, while also delivering returns on investments. And of course, this will be hinging on the issue of responsible investment. So Karen, please.
Thank you so much, Joth. It's a pleasure to be with you today on this panel and at this conference, and just to echo your sentiments on, condolences and thoughts with the people of the Republic of Haiti on such a difficult day. Latin America and the Caribbean is really a region of oceans. 25% of the population lives on or near the coast, and in the Caribbean that goes up to 100%. And the ocean provides close to $21 billion in GDP to the region. So when we're thinking about financial innovation and how it can build resilience to ocean risk, as well as delivering returns on investment, I think we need to think about the financial sector as either being enablers, so unlocking capital and increasing finance where it's lacking, or as gatekeepers, really redirecting investments towards more sustainable and equitable practices. The finance sector has really been able to create financial instruments whenever they've needed to, whether it's creating a new value through, the euro, for instance, to creating other instruments. And so critical in doing that is really identifying the potential value that can be accrued, or identifying the value at risk that needs to be protected in creating those instruments. And so this is where the Ocean Risk and Resilience Action Alliance, or ORA, comes in. ORA is a unique multi-sector collaboration between governments, financial institutions, the insurance industry, environmental organizations, multilaterals, as well as stakeholders from the global south. And we put the best brains in the business together around the table to pioneer finance and insurance products that incentivize investment into blue nature, with, as was mentioned before, a goal of driving $500 million of investment into marine and coastal nature by 2030, and surfacing at least 15 novel finance products by 2025. Our members include Canada and the United Kingdom. They include NGOs like the Nature Conservancy, WWF, and Conservation International. We have project partners working on the ground like the Mesoamerican Reef Fund. And from the private sector, our anchor, really leading finance partner is Deutsche Bank, and our leading insurance partner is AXA. We also work really closely with the Global Resilience Partnership, which co-hosts the Alliance with Ocean Unite, so we can crowd in all of their knowledge of working in the resilience space as we are developing these products. And really, you know, the goal to catalyze investment, deliver innovation, generate impact, and work internationally and at scale to build the next generation of cost-effective, bankable finance and insurance products, channeling capital towards investments that mitigate ocean risk and build resilience in coastal communities that are adapting to climate change. In doing that, we need to think about risk pooling, about blending finance and securing concessionary investment. We also need to think about changing behavior. You know, traditionally, investments into grey infrastructure have managed to secure financing and generate return for investments into that sector for seawalls, ports, hotels, and resorts in coastal areas, or roads and rail to navigate along. We believe it's time to think beyond concrete, because when it comes to ocean risk, built grey solutions are some of the most expensive and least adaptable to change. They could also be stranded assets that lose economic value ahead of their anticipated useful life because of environmental shocks or social disruption. So I'm looking forward to talking with all of you, showcasing some of the products we're developing and talking about how we can invest in nature and bring bankable returns for folks on the ground, building resilience, social and economic resilience, as well as enabling a bankable return for those investors. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Karen, for those opening remarks, and certainly very interested to hear about the target of $500 million of investment by 2030, and the role of the Alliance in terms of moving that forward. So that's really very interesting and sets a good stage in terms of the discussion to come, and you sharing some more information on that. Next, we will go to Dr. Orville Gray. And Dr. Gray is a coastal ecologist and climate change researcher by training. So he understands fundamentally some of these issues that he is now asked to address from a finance perspective. He's currently the regional manager of the Caribbean and Brazil at the Green Climate Fund, and I know the GCF has a high level of visibility, and we're very happy that Orville could join us for this session to share some perspectives. And so Orville, if you could please, in your opening statement, provide a perspective on how multilateral funds like the Green Climate Fund can lead the way on ensuring appropriate financing to address climate adaptation and to ensure resilience. Orville?
Thank you, Joth, and thank you to the team for the invitation. I'm happy to be on panel with such distinguished guests. Thanks to the colleagues who are joining from all over, it seems. Hopefully we'll have an engaging conversation. And similarly, my condolences and respects to the people in Haiti on the tragic events today and what has been leading up to it and likely what will follow. We can only hold them in our thoughts and pray for a speedy end and return to stability. That said, looking at what we are here to discuss, the Green Climate Fund, as you know, it's pretty much the largest climate financing institution coming out of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It's a creature of that convention, established at the 16th Conference of the Parties in 2010, and our first board meeting in 2012. And we started out with roughly $7.2 billion in investment from developed countries to support developing countries. We approved our first project in 2015, and up to just before this board meeting, we had our first replenishment period that was in 2020 of $9.8 billion. So we have been well supported. Just coming out of our board meeting that just ended last week, I believe there was another $500 million of support that has been pledged in 4 projects. So there's quite a bit happening and projects that will impact Latin America and the Caribbean region and SIDS on a whole. To date, I believe we're just under $9 billion in projects that have been approved by the GCF, with over 100 projects under implementation, close to about 150 projects in total, over 100 accredited entities, and also over 100 countries reached. So we're pushing the paradigm shift to fostering that low emission and climate resilient development pathway for developing countries, as articulated through their various strategies and plans, including the NDCs that have been published. From the perspective of the Caribbean region and what we're here to talk about, and in terms of the access, GCF clients by and large are developing countries. Caribbean SIDS make up a huge component of that. My portfolio has 14 Caribbean SIDS involved. We've had a slight change in my portfolio, so I'm no longer covering Brazil, but I'm covering all the CARICOM countries in the Caribbean. And from that perspective, trying to understand what are their priorities as articulated through these strategies and policies, whether it be national adaptation plans or their NDCs, is what's that pipeline of priority projects and how can the GCF provide support for that. GCF, put support through projects through what we refer to as accredited entities. So we also want to understand how can we support the Caribbean in getting entities that they're interested in coming on board and being accredited with the GCF. One of those areas that we're pushing hard right now is how to get a native private sector entity on board, accredited to the GCF, that can support private sector projects on climate change adaptation in the region. We see our countries as being primary in everything we do. So country ownership is very key. Therefore, it means that projects coming into the region must be approved by countries. And therefore, we anticipate that with the discussions with the GCF and other stakeholders in the region, that we can definitely get to the heart of where the priorities lie in countries and how to help move them forward. So I'm hoping in this conversation that we can take that discussion a little further, hoping that I can open up more insights on the GCF and its operations, understanding the financial instruments we use, understanding the nuances in terms of getting things through, understanding things like a readiness program that builds support at the base level to ensure that the projects that are coming on board can be sustainable and successful. So looking forward to this conversation, and thank you for having me.
Great, thanks very much, Thanks very much to you, to Orville, for those statements. It's really very interesting to note that there's a tremendous amount of funds which have been committed. It'll be interesting, Orville, to hear from you how much of that 9 billion in projects which have been approved, how much of that actually has been approved for the Caribbean region. And certainly, I know you would share that as we engage in the panel. I also noted that you're looking for a native private sector entity to get accredited, and certainly that is extremely progressive. Happy to hear that. And then, of course, on issues related to the number of accredited entities that are operating within the region. I know we have quite a few, and maybe you can share some more information on that as we engage. We're talking about private sector. I will go next to Jake Kheel. Jake Kheel is the Vice President at Grupo Puntacana. Jake is a sustainability innovator, author, an award-winning documentary filmmaker. He's the author of the book, Waking the Sleeping Giant, Unlocking the Hidden Power of Business to Save Our Planet. His organization, Fundación Grupo Puntacana, is also the recipient of a CBF EBA facility grant. So we believe that Jake is very well placed, certainly in the context of his book, in terms of unlocking the hidden power of the business sector to save our planet, to speak on issues related to the private sector engagement. So Jake, if you could please provide a perspective on the role of the private sector, the business community, to provide funding and to attract grant and non-grant resources as a model for financing climate change adaptation and resilience building. And also, if you could share some information on our joint EBA project as it relates to that subject. Jake?
Hello, and thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in this panel. I am the Vice President of Sustainability for Grupo Puntacana. Grupo Puntacana is a tourism development company in the eastern part of the Dominican Republic. We have been operating now for over 50 years. We are a unique company in the sense that we operate hotels, private real estate development, but also more interestingly, we own and operate a private international airport, the largest in the Dominican Republic and one of the largest in the Caribbean. And also much of the infrastructure that supports our resort, including an electric company, a water distribution company, and a water treatment facility. So I give a little bit of that background to explain sort of our role in the Dominican Republic as a driver in the tourism economy, and the relationship of tourism in small islands like the Dominican Republic, but also to the oceans and to the protection of the oceans and marine biodiversity. If you look at the type of tourism we promote in the Caribbean region, much of it is related to coastal areas, to beaches, to sun and sand. And those are relationships that are directly linked to the health of local coastal ecosystems, including mangroves, seagrass beds, and coral reef ecosystems. So that's the way that our company looks at the marine environment. It is an asset that we are blessed to have and to utilize for our business, but it's also something that we need to invest, to protect, to enhance, and when necessary, to restore. So that gives us the context of our perspective as a business and the way that we believe most businesses operating in the tourism sector in the Dominican Republic and in the Caribbean in general should look at this marine environment as one of our primary assets, and we need to invest to protect it. And so for a number of years, our company has been committed to the conservation of our reef ecosystem. There's an 8-kilometer coral reef in front of our property that extends to the south of our property and to the north of our property. And we've developed a number of innovative strategies for financing our work, both conservation efforts, marine co-management efforts of a marine protected area, and also restoration efforts. The way that we have structured much of the work that we've done is the company, Grupo Puntacana, provides resources for our foundation as baseline funding for staffing, for administration, for space to operate laboratory facilities, research facilities, dormitory facilities for researchers and for students. And then we utilize that to leverage other sources of funding so that when we receive funding from external sources, nearly all of those resources go towards new projects or expanding existing projects or financing new activities. So it becomes a point of leverage in order to attract new financing and new donations. We use both private sector investment and donations and contributions. We use partnerships with other international organizations. We work very closely with a number of local nonprofits as well as international organizations such as Nature Conservancy, Blue Finance, Counterpart International, and others. And then we work very closely with the local community in our region in Puntacana. And so the success that we've had in many ways has been from a point of view of an ongoing support from the company, a very close relationship, working relationship with the Dominican government, and gain a lot of credibility through our programs over the years. That's given us a lot of flexibility to implement projects that protect the coastal area with the government and often with their approval, but without their direct participation. And has allowed us to be very innovative and apply the resources that we have to be much more experimental than if we had simply relied exclusively on private funding from the company or solely from donations. So we have very much a blended finance model, and the CBF EBA project that we're managing now is a perfect example of how our company has existing infrastructure. We have a Center for Marine Innovation, which is a laboratory space where we had begun many years ago doing coral restoration in water nurseries to generate coral tissue to be transplanted back onto the reef. And more recently had begun efforts to use land-based nurseries to diversify the amount and types and species of corals that we're working with. And so the EBA project that we have, the ecosystem-based adaptation facility project, is specifically to scale up our efforts, because as a private company and with small donations and small grants and partnerships, we're able to cover a certain amount of ground. We're able to undertake a certain amount of restoration work, but with this injection of these types of resources, it elevates our profile. It allows us to hire more staff. It allows us to incorporate new technologies, to rely on advice from other experts and consultants in the field, and really expand our efforts. And I would say that we are extremely unique in the Caribbean, and specifically in the Dominican Republic. I don't know of any other resort development companies that have an active foundation that is not simply giving out charitable donations, but is really managing and expanding its own projects, that works with international donors, that has partnerships over many years with many different institutions, scientific, non-for-profit universities, and really has made a big emphasis of sharing our experience. And so that was part of the idea of writing the book, Waking the Sleeping Giant, was really to share with others the experience we've had from the point of view of the private sector, to share some of the lessons that we've learned, and also share some of the things that haven't worked, and sharing some of our failures. And this is also quite unique for the private sector. So we are pleased to be here and share some of the experiences we've had in Puntacana, and we've been able to expand beyond the realm of just our resort in Puntacana, and really shared on a much larger stage in the Dominican Republic and to a number of partners throughout the Caribbean region.
Thank you so much, Jake, for those opening remarks. And certainly, I think you are correct when you say that you are a pioneer in the area in terms of private sector engagement in the context of the marine environment. And as you say, looking at it as an asset, which certainly it's clear that it is an asset to the tourism sector. Without it, you would have no business, I would imagine. And so it makes really good sense to invest in ensuring that it remains in a condition that continues to support business and continues to support the economy. And maybe we recognize as well, and from a previous conversation this morning on the blue economy, that there is another private sector actor that we are aware of, which is the Sandals Foundation, which is also very active. And I think it would be really interesting, if you haven't already, Jake, to sort of have a conversation with the Sandals Foundation as to their thinking, and maybe there can be an opportunity for exchange in terms of the approach. I think that would be really very interesting. But then to move now to maybe a second round of questions to the panelists, and maybe to circle back now to Karen, and Karen, to give you an opportunity to expand on what you shared in your opening remarks, and to maybe frame it in terms of this prompt question that climate finance solutions can also be seen as nature financing solutions. And as the CEO of the Jeff said yesterday, nature is our safety net. And I think that is absolutely correct. The question that I would put to you is, how should climate finance solutions be designed to address mitigation, adaptation, and resilience needs, while also promoting and ensuring conservation of nature? And please, Karen, feel free to expand on some of the elements of the design of the program that you are overseeing. Karen?
Sure, thank you. It is such a big question, so I'm going to try and start really wide and then focus in a little bit. I think what's interesting to see is the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which is kind of like the IPCC for biodiversity, did a global assessment, and they estimated that around 37% of climate change mitigation efforts could be achieved through nature-based solutions, while other climate adaptation and mitigation solutions can often be implemented in ways that are either biodiversity positive or negative. So in looking at climate solutions, we also need to think about the impacts on biodiversity. Hydropower facility can be developed in a way that destroys biodiversity or creates added value by restoring a valuable ecosystem. We can see, solar power fields that result in biological deserts, or in biologically rich areas that provide multiple ecosystem services. And so we really need to think about climate solutions that are leading to net zero solutions, but also biodiversity positive results. And in many instances, investing in nature is also incredibly cost effective. So the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility has found that in 7 out of the 8 countries that they looked at, reef and mangrove restoration were amongst the most effective, cost-effective approaches for coastal risk reduction and adaptation. And that is kind of backed up by a 2019 study, again focused on the Caribbean, that concluded that coral reef and mangrove restoration projects in the region are between 10 and 100 times cheaper than artificial coastal defenses, where the medium cost for coral reef restoration in the Caribbean are around $1 million per kilometer, compared to $19 million for artificial breakwaters and levees. So I think this goes back to the discussion about viewing nature as putting a value on that nature. So not viewing it as an unaccounted for externality, and recognizing its value as well as its intrinsic value and accounting for it. And that's when we do that, we can then begin to take some of the tried and tested financial products and put them to work with nature to build resilience and deliver those bankable returns. And there's a super example that has been worked on by Willis Towers Watson, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Mesoamerican Reef Fund, and the Nature Conservancy. And that's in the Mesoamerican Reef, looking at deploying parametric insurance to protect areas of the reef from extreme storm events. So essentially, that is not just looking at the impacts post the storm, but looking at what needs to be done to mitigate the risk before a storm happens. So making sure that the reefs are well looked after, and that some of the potential risk multipliers from pollution or waste are removed, as well as, should a storm hit, being able to very quickly deploy funds to invest in cleaning up the reef and working with local communities to cleaning up that reef, which is critical for the coral to recover immediately after a storm event. And the IDB has actually done a recent economic valuation of the entire reef, accounting for both the intrinsic as well as use values, so fishing, tourism, etc. And it's really incredible to see how, when you have that baseline knowledge, you can then begin to show that there is value for municipalities, for the tourism sector and the resorts that are built in those regions, as well as to national governments who are thinking about keeping communities intact in an age of change. And those are the kind of tools we need to look at developing across the Caribbean on a large scale, so large scale parametric insurance, down to really micro insurance and microfinance measures like life insurance for small scale fishers, or potentially incentivizing good behavior, or that in terms of the types of fishing that can take place, so that it isn't destructive fishing, by providing either life insurance or financial literacy and knowledge for small scale fishers, so that they can build up their financial security and get out of some of the debt traps that sometimes they are caught in. So, you know, really a wide swath of potential products if we can account for the value of nature and think about biodiversity positive investments that are also focused on driving to net zero outcomes at the same time.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Karen, for those additional remarks. And yes, certainly our own experience and learning is that, as you mentioned, coral reefs and mangroves are much more effective in terms of dealing with the issues with regards to climate change impacts. And the experience as well is that it is significantly cheaper as well. And so investing in nature to offset the impacts of climate change is certainly showing that that's the way to go. And to add to that, Karen, as well, in the context of certainly within our region, you know, there is indeed sometimes some difficulties in forecasting correctly what a future scenario will be in terms of sea level rise or intensity of waves, etc. And I think what has been demonstrated as well is that natural systems, as you mentioned, mangroves and coral reefs, tend to demonstrate a higher level of resilience to uncertainty in the context of if you do not have accurate information in terms of a forecasted future scenario, that there is indeed greater flexibility and resilience which is offered by natural systems. So it certainly makes good sense to invest in these natural systems. And then on your point about parametric insurance, I mean, we know that within the region, there is a regional entity which has been set up to look at the impacts of hurricanes and extreme weather events on participating states. And they have started expanding or extending out, I should say, into issues related to impact on fisheries and other things. And certainly, I know that there is an interest in looking at issues related to parametric type insurance with regards to damage to marine ecosystems. So certainly there is a foundation that we can build on. And I think it's a matter of pushing these initiatives forward. Thanks very much for those comments. Wanted to come back to Orville, and Orville, to build on what you have presented with regards to GCF and its operations in the Caribbean. But I wanted you to address this issue. What to your mind is the major challenge or the major challenges with Caribbean SIDS in accessing financing from the GCF? And how can these obstacles be resolved? And if you can, Orville, in responding to that, maybe give an indication as to, how successful Caribbean SIDS have been in the context of securing funding thus far from the GCF. Orville?
Thanks, Joth. Yeah, that's the money question when it comes to GCF, access to financing from the GCF. And I'm sure many on the panel and those listening have heard the cry that the GCF is very difficult to work with. And I won't say no. I mean, there are challenges in terms of how we do things at times. I think some of it has to do with, the level of awareness of the GCF and what it's meant to do in terms of how it's structured. And I think from that perspective, sometimes the challenges can be overcome. But what I'll say is, I mean, we do have quite a bit of support that we provide to countries. And in terms of the access, as I mentioned before, we see country ownership as being very key. And therefore, from that perspective, we do work with what we refer to as our nationally designated authorities. So these are entities that are nominated by countries that usually then add a focal point, may even add technical focal points to the list to help guide the GCF in its conversations with countries on what they can and cannot do. The access issue, I mean, in the Caribbean right now, I mean, we have a program that we refer to as the Readiness Program. This program helps to provide capacity support, helps to build that capacity that institutions need to address and access climate financing. It also helps to lay the groundwork for adaptation planning at the basic level in terms of putting in the systems in place to support the large adaptation projects that need to be brought on board. That adaptation planning window is a $3 million one-time window. We also have the Readiness Program, which is a recurring window, which is $1 million per annum, renewable each year. So, from that perspective, we are supportive in helping countries to build their capacity, build their awareness with other institutions in their countries, and thereby, be able to access well. The accreditation is one other aspect of this. So countries are able to nominate entities that they consider to be useful in helping them to implement the types of projects they want. So these are entities that come accredited to the GCF that are then fully responsible for taking a project forward to the GCF with the support of countries and fully responsible for their implementation, hence the success of these projects. And projects, of course, have no cap on them. It just depends on what it is that the projects are structured around and how we can take these projects forward. So from that perspective, just to give you a number, we have 4 direct access entities in the Caribbean region, CDB, 5 Cs, which are regional, and then we have national entities such as the Department of Environment in Antigua and Barbuda, and PACT in Belize. we have a pipeline of nominated entities that we're working to get accredited from other countries. I know the process is slow for many. There are lots of frustrations there, but from the regional team, we're trying our best to see how we can, help to bridge that gap in understanding, particularly with respect to the types of institutions that are being nominated for accreditation. We have 14 countries in my cohort, and from that, we're looking at roughly $100 million already approved in readiness for Latin America and the Caribbean region. 36 million of that is for the Caribbean. $1.6 billion already approved in projects for Latin America and the Caribbean. We have 11 projects that are predominantly for or supporting Caribbean countries. We have, as I mentioned, in terms of the 37 million that are in readiness, we have 60 projects approved, and this is ongoing. So these numbers are subject to change with the numbers incoming, but we have at least another 30 odd projects in the pipeline that we're looking to advance, which could potentially be for another $25 to $30 million. We have a window that we refer to as the project preparation facility window, wherein, if a project comes in and it needs additional support to do the feasibility studies and other necessary things, the gender policy that needs to be developed, the ESSG aspects that need to be addressed. There's $1.5 million that's available there per project, depending on the circumstances. And in that respect, we have already approved 5 of those for Belize, Barbados, Bahamas, Jamaica, St. Lucia, totaling just under $4 million. So, and we also have another 4 in the pipeline for Caribbean countries. So the region has been accessing support. I mean, we have 11 projects that are being implemented in the region. So we're getting there. It's just been a little bit slow to get these numbers up, but based on what we see in the pipeline, we're looking at nearly 21 public sector projects in the pipeline, which is roughly around $700 million. And then another 7 to 8 private sector projects, which is just under $1 billion. So there's quite a bit there that we are working through with countries and accredited entities to move through the process and get them approved, and thereby, build the type of support that we need in the region. And, following up on one of the things that Karen mentioned before, and I've noted it also in the chat window, is that the aspect of the ecosystem or the environment and its contribution to building resilience, which has been largely ignored in terms of infrastructural development, is something that the GCF takes significant interest in. So we are working with the Coalition of Climate Resilient Infrastructure to help to address some of these issues that we're working on. And from that perspective, we have at least 2 countries in the Caribbean, Jamaica being the pilot, that we're hoping to be able to work on and move through to develop a bankable pipeline of projects that can then bring in the ecosystem-based adaptation or other green infrastructure infrastructure into the development planning of the country to build that climate resilience that we're looking at. So we're getting there. We're not where we want to be, but we believe the conversation is moving well. We see the projects coming in. One of the things that, as I said before, is that we really want to see a private sector entity that's native come in, because we do have entities that are coming into support from the private sector space. But what we find is that largely so far, they have been coming with global projects. So you may have 1 or 2 Caribbean countries being a part of a global project. And of course, the big question there is how much of these large billion-dollar projects actually get implemented to a significant level in a Caribbean country. So we want to see our private sector in the region come on board and help to support those pipeline of projects that the countries are looking forward to. And as I've been saying in a number of fora in recent times, is we need to look at the private sector aspect of it, because this whole issue of climate change and the impacts that we're likely to see, there is a role for governments to play, but there's an increasing role for the private sector, because when you look at, for instance, things like supply chains and how that can be significantly impacted by a climate event, it underscores the need to bring the private sector on board. So access is still an issue, but we are working hard on trying to address these, and we're moving projects through. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Orville, for that very, very clear response to the question. I think certainly we all understand that the mechanism going through the GCF has to follow some clearly defined protocols and measures which needs to be met, and not all organizations are sometimes equipped to meet those requirements, and hence the reason why you would have moved in the direction of accredited organizations to be able to access the funding. I think certainly what we need to recognize as well, and to complement funding which is available through mechanisms such as the GCF, that we do need sort of easier access mechanisms for organizations who may require maybe not as large funding as GCF is offering, but you know, the amount of funds which they can reasonably well manage in terms of implementation. And just to share with you that that was the, the philosophy behind the ecosystem-based adaptation facility, that the intent was that we would have grants ranging from $250,000 to $2 million, and that it would be a sort of a fast track mechanism. The timeline that we had set with that from the point of applying through our call for proposals and actually successfully landing a project, we anticipate that that would take 1 year. And in the grand schemes of the time that it takes to access some of these international mechanisms, that we feel that that is a reasonable time frame. So just wanted to make the point as well, Orville, that the GCF might not be the panacea for all who require funding, but that it certainly is a mechanism where you can access sizable grants to implement projects maybe over the longer term. And I certainly hear your point with regards to, how successful these projects are being implemented or can be implemented. It would be great to follow, the pool of projects that you have identified over time to see what the success rate is. So thanks very much for sharing that perspective. I just wanted to shift to Jake, and Jake, to frame this scenario and question for you. We recognize that there is restricted capacity within some countries within the Caribbean to formulate successful project proposals. And this has been flagged as a hindrance to access available funding. Is this an issue in your view, and how can this be overcome? Certainly, to respond to that issue, Jake, from your own experience. And as I mentioned, one of the mechanisms that we have employed is the EBA facility. And to overcome the issue with regards to restricted capacity, we, through our mechanism, is allowing international organizations with a track record of working in the Caribbean to apply for funding where they partner with Caribbean organizations. And we feel that that is a mechanism which can help to build capacity within Caribbean organizations where, they may be, a little bit behind in terms of developing those quality of projects, even for the EBA facility. Is this an approach that you support, Jake? And from your own experience, how does that work?
Yeah, I think there is certainly some room to grow in our region in terms of the ability of the smaller and medium-sized organizations to manage larger funds, to apply for these funds, be able to structure the projects in a way that makes sense both for the donors and for the size of the organizations operating the projects. So the strategy has been for many small organizations to sort of bundle with a larger organization with more experience and more expertise. And I think that does work, provided that there's somewhat of an off-ramp, right? Because these big organizations tend to get a lot of the funding and continue to be sort of a magnet for the funding. And the small organizations tend to stay small or stay within the applications as a recipient within a larger project managed by someone else. So the capacity doesn't necessarily get increased. I think that's definitely a major concern in the Dominican Republic, and you have a limited number of organizations that really have the capacity, maybe not to manage projects, but to structure the applications and the proposals and the budgeting and all that goes into managing some of these more complex projects. So I think there's a lot of room to grow there. We have worked with some of the bigger organizations and found that to be incredibly useful, but it works best when they are willing to impart some of their knowledge and share some of the experience and help your organization grow and be able to apply on your own. And we've been fortunate to have that. And I know other organizations have not had the same experience where they feel that they're sort of always being relied upon as a smaller member of a larger consortium, and they're not necessarily getting the increasing capacity. I've also been following the Q&A and a lot of the comments on the gray versus sort of green infrastructure, especially marine environments. If I could comment on that really quickly from the private sector perspective, we are at a very interesting moment to really look at ecosystem-based adaptation for things that have traditionally used just infrastructure projects and engineering solutions. And we are trying to lead in the Dominican Republic some of the conversations and some of the initiative to create examples, because I think one of the major deficiencies for ecosystem-based projects, at least from the perspective of the private sector, is a lack of examples. We don't have a lot to rely on, and so we go back to what we have traditionally relied on. So I'll give you an example. Right now, there is a international multilateral funded project with the Dominican Ministry of Tourism to support restoration of beaches. And from the very beginnings of that project, it was structured so that it would be more of an ecosystem-based solution, that they would be looking at coral restoration, they would be looking at mangrove restoration, they'd be looking at ways to build hybrid solutions where we had some built infrastructure and engineering solutions that would combine with ecosystem solutions. But there's so few examples to rely on, and there's so little expertise in this, that the fallback is to go straight back into engineered solutions. And that seems to be what's happening. And so the Ministry of Tourism is not going to take a risk with multilateral funding from an important donor. The donor has given the money to the Dominican government to manage the project and is not going to intervene. And so what seems to be happening is that we're going to have a completely engineered solution, and they're trying to tack on coral restoration as sort of an add-on to give it the flavor or the essence of a ecosystem-based adaptation solution. And I think we're really missing a huge opportunity. And we really need to get into the government and get into these multilateral donors. We need to create examples, whether they're even just one small beach or one small intervention, so that we have a portfolio of examples that we can rely on. And I know that Nature Conservancy has done a really good job in Mexico with the Mesoamerican Reef and this model for funding through insurance and parametric insurance. And they've also done some work, I believe it was in the Grenadines, where they've done sort of a hybrid reef structure that was built specifically for beach protection and restoration, but also has ecological functions and imitates some of the functions of a reef. I think we need more examples of that. We need them on a much larger scale, because as much of the commentary has been in the Q&A and in the chats, cities like Miami don't have a lot to go on in terms of green solutions and ecosystem-based solutions. And so the fallback are walls and riprap and breakwaters and engineered solutions. And there's a lot of pressure from those companies that design those solutions to continue them and to show that they're the only way to do it. And since they don't have the expertise or the interest in more hybridized solutions or green solutions, there's not a lot of competition out there. So I think we need more examples. I think we need more experimentation. I think we need to infiltrate in the government and in the private sector and really show them examples of things that can work. And we are willing to be a pioneer through our company and doing some of the work. but it's experimental. We really need support from international organizations, from donors to say, okay, we're going to do a hybrid restoration beach solution that imitates the functions of a coral reef, but we're not going to rely exclusively on the private sector to pay for this, at least as a pilot or an experiment, because we need more examples. So that was just something I want to comment. It's an area that we're really working on extensively with partners from Nature Conservancy, even from a few of the reinsurers. We've been looking at studies with universities to try and determine where there are areas of erosion, for example, on our property that could rely on sort of hybrid solutions, ways to finance that. So we're very interested in this area, and I think it's a huge area for expansion. It's a way to fund in the future, restoration of coral reefs, providing that they also imitate some of these infrastructure protection services that coral reefs that provide when they're healthy and intact. So I just wanted to add that. I think it's a fascinating subject, and it seemed like there's a lot of commentary happening on it, and it seems this space that we're in, and it's this sort of Wild West, and I think we need to occupy this space and create examples and really push this agenda forward, or going forward as we face more changes with climate, we're going to rely on these traditional solutions, and they're very very limited in their ability to respond to some of the challenges we're going to be facing.
Thanks very much, Jake. And certainly I couldn't agree with you more that we do need some more innovation, or maybe innovative type projects, which are looking to test, what we call hybrid solutions, because we certainly recognize that while we are moving towards and recognizing the importance of nature-based solutions, that in many cases, and this is consistent with some of the comments that we have received, as well as questions which have been posed, that nature-based solutions are sometimes inadequate to address issues which might be more immediate, because we recognize that, including or putting in place or improving the conditions of mangrove wetlands and coral reefs are sort of longer term based. And these projects, in order to see any real success, you're talking, at least 5 years to 7 years in terms of activity. And the solutions which are required are sometimes more immediate. So, certainly I think the community is recognizing that under the requirements to adapt to a changing climate, that nature-based solutions is a big chunk, and we certainly have to move in that direction. But we do need to blend it with the traditional means of adaptation, the various revetment walls and other constructions, dikes, etc., which are being used. But I will say to you that in my own experience, governments are very, very reluctant to move from these traditional means of ensuring that erosion is controlled to nature-based solutions. And it has a lot to do with what you have mentioned, that we need to provide evidence that it can happen, and evidence in the context of solutions which have been applied within our region, not necessarily outside of our region. And so the EBA facility certainly has this as one of its intended outputs, that through the projects that we are supporting, including the project with Fundación Grupo Puntacana, Jake, that we can demonstrate that these types of interventions can really work. There is a focus on hybrid solutions, as you have pointed out, and there are now some activities that we're looking at within the second set of projects. But to share with you that that many see a hybrid project as having a component dealing with nature, maybe restoring a coral reef, and then having a revetment wall somewhere in the same vicinity. And, the two does not constitute a hybrid approach in many cases. It has to be well thought through and planned, and that they're well integrated. So yes, your point is very well taken, and we're hoping that, some of the projects that are being implemented through the EBA facility can indeed provide some examples of what you have requested. And that I have seen several comments coming through. I wanted to go back to Orville and to read now some of the questions which are being put into the Q&A box. And this comes from an anonymous attendee, Orville, addressed to you because it's on the GCF. Question is the GCF considering flexible pathways to access, and are there any ways to reduce government bureaucracy or influence to stimulate the greater private sector engagement and participation? Is the GCF considering a standing committee for private sector as part of the expansion of the stakeholder engagement? So, Orville, I hope you can respond to that question.
Thanks, Joth. Yeah, that's a very interesting question. What I can say is that the GCF is looking at ways in which we can have a more direct conversation with private sector stakeholders. As part of that, we have what we refer to as our private sector facility. And this facility helps us in having persons in the organization who understands the workings of the private sector, to be able to engage with our private sector colleagues in the region, to better understand their needs and how we can provide support. The challenge with what is being suggested is that the decision that created the GCF essentially puts the decision-making power in the hands of the government. And this is a decision that came through the Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So, any deviations to that will likely have to come, for instance, from the elected representatives on the board of the GCF, which is independent of the Secretariat itself, or through decisions that have been adopted at the level of the Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, in which the stakeholder groups such as the private sector do get a chance to have a say. So there are avenues for this to come through. What is happening is that in several countries, they have actually set up institutions whereby the private sector, for instance, is a part of those institutions in the vetting and approval of projects that come to the GCF. So that is also another way in which that sort of conversation can take place at the national level. The question is, how do we get the private sector to engage with the government at the national level to say, we are an important and significant player in this discussion. We cannot just be considered as being outside of the remit of national development, but have to be seen as integral to that process, and thereby have a say as to what goes forward in terms of priority projects for countries, or how do private sector design projects get incorporated as part of the priority listing of projects that need to be implemented. So I think there are a number of ways that this can be done, but the GCF is willing to have these conversations to see how we can, for instance, share these lessons with our board, that they can take these decisions. But I think it would also be prudent for our private sector entities to also get to know the board members and thereby, prod them in the direction of change that we're looking for. I hope that's helpful.
It's a really good response, Orville. I see your diplomatic skills are really well tuned as well. Thanks for that response, which can sometimes be a challenging question to respond to. I think you did really well. I wanted to go to Karen, and Karen's question for you. Access to ocean finance and resources is limited. I think we would all agree to that, and maybe not equitably distributed. What is the biggest climate finance challenge for Caribbean developing countries? Karen.
Oh, that's a big in the ocean space, I think it has to be lack of knowledge. Honestly, I think it's lack of knowledge by policymakers in the private as well as the public sector, and the understanding of the issue at all. I think when it comes to a region like the Caribbean, folks are looking a lot at issues on land and potentially in immediate coastal areas in terms of potential harm. When we think of ocean risk, I think we've got to think of everything that's happening in the ocean and how those risks, whether they're immediate onset risks from extreme storm events or slow onset risks from sea level rise, and then the risk multipliers from things like illegal fishing or pollution are taken into account as part of that whole mix. So I think there's a whole lot of knowledge that is missing out there. And I think part of what we need to do, and certainly what we're trying to do through the Ocean Risk Alliance, is to provide some ocean financial literacy to both the private and the public sector to understand how to mitigate against some of those risks. And then obviously there's, I think, some of the issues that have been raised in this discussion today, which is this disconnect between the private and the public sector. And I think quite a convenient place in a way for public and private sector investors to be, where the public sector is waiting for private sector to come in, and the private sector is saying we need concession refinancing, or we need the public sector to come in first before we'll take that next step. And it enables all of them to kind of watch and wait, which isn't helpful, I think, to any of us. So I think, Jake's points about the importance of having some of these pilot projects, getting them in the water, showing the value, the potential value that can result, the potential returns that can result from those investments, the need to develop these hybrid solutions as a pathway forward, and so that you can get some of the short-term returns as well as plan for the longer returns. But also, I think, and you referenced it earlier, as the Alliance, we've set this goal of activating $500 million of investment into the space by 2030. And when you look at, what Orville was saying early on, how the Green Climate Fund has already approved $9 billion worth of projects since its inception, you have to wonder whether that's a big enough amount. We are hoping that within 5 years, we can increase that amount exponentially, but it is indicative of the fact that in our space, in the ocean space, it is highly underfinanced. We have a lot of work to do to educate, to do the research, to model forward, to show investors what the potential risks are and how we need to drive investment into our space. And I think we've got to use both the focus on getting to net zero as well as biodiversity positive investments, particularly in a region like the Caribbean, to drive the type of investment we need to see. So, this is an all hands on deck kind of moment. And I think what we need to do is get willing partners around the table so that we can showcase the opportunities and also build the blended finance instruments that can drive investment into the Caribbean as a region, and take some of those investments globally as well, because that's the kind of focus we need.
Thanks very much, Karen, for that response. I'm going to the questions put into the Q&A box, and there is a fair amount of questions on the issue of GCF, and we have touched on some of those already, and Orville has responded. Just wanted to mix it up a bit, and there is a question coming from Renan Rocha from Pro Azul. And the question is, what are the main differences between government environmental fund and a non-governmental environmental fund in terms of resources mobilization? As a government environmental fund, is it possible to establish an endowment fund? And I certainly can respond and invite anyone from the panel to maybe to respond to that as well. I do think it is indeed entirely possible to have a government fund focused on, for example, on environment. The example that I could give is the Green Fund of Trinidad and Tobago, which has been set up really for that intent in terms of supporting projects focused on environment and nature solutions. It is quite a significant fund at this point in time. It's a $1 billion fund. And I think the challenge, and one of my colleagues who recently joined the CBF worked there for some time, Ibrahim Abdullah. And, certainly I think the challenge there is, I think, dealing with government bureaucracy, because, because it's an environmental fund, you do not step aside of government bureaucracy. It still is sometimes an issue. But the mechanism for supporting it really has been a tax, which has been imposed on gross revenue from the private sector. So they contribute into that fund. And so it's a very viable one. I think the issues that remain to be resolved is how can they actively utilize the funds within the Green Climate Fund. And to share as well that the National Conservation Trust funds are indeed set up as NGO operated, but they are operated with a board which contains majority NGOs and, but also with government representation. So there is that opportunity to also have governments participate in terms of how the funds are utilized, but the decision is ultimately, made by the committee. I wanted, as we come towards the end of the session, we have a few more minutes left, to sort of circle back and maybe pose this as an open question to the panelists. We do have the upcoming UNFC meetings coming up in Scotland, not too far away. The question is, what should Caribbean governments focus on at that particular conference? What are the critical issues that we need to lobby for in the context of the climate change convention project? Karen, you already hinted on a larger amount of funds which needs to go into the Green Climate Fund. So maybe, Orville, I can start with you and then ask the other two panelists to maybe respond to it as well. Well, Orville?
I see you putting me on the spot, Joth. It's a tricky little spot. But what I'll say is that we had a conversation with CARICOM SIDS in March of this year at our regional dialogue. And what was clear to us was that the issue of ambition is still very much paramount. Looking at where we are, looking at the impacts that we're seeing. I mean, if you look at just what Elsa has reminded us of in the past few days, it's very clear that, this is still a significant and real issue for us as Caribbean SIDS. So the question is, how do we get the larger polluters to look at their commitments and be even more ambitious, how to bring it forward, even if we're not changing the numbers, but how do we get that change to happen at an earlier time to build that momentum that is needed and hopefully be able to arrest the problem a few decades earlier than anticipated. I mean, it's still a dream for us, that 1.5, and I think that is something that Caribbean SIDS should hold on to. The level of funding that is required, the access to finance that we keep hammering on. I mean, I think these are things that I would expect SIDS to still be talking about, but I think they also need to, look at, what sort of support they can have outside of that to build the level of, how to bring in the other stakeholders on board, how to get them at a level of understanding and through the conference of the parties to be able to distill that down through the various stakeholder groups. I mean, you have the global mayoral groups, you have the large stakeholder groups, you have the MDBs, and all of these entities that are coming in. How do we get to a point where in the 100 billion by 2020, which we have now passed and still not achieved in the sense that most thought of it, can actually be achieved through a diversity of different funding sources? Because to be honest, I think it would be naive of us to think that there will be $100 billion in the GCF per annum going forward. I don't think that is going to happen. But the conversation around how to get to that $100 billion across a diversity of sources is something that countries need to have a serious conversation with and push industries, push developed countries and others who are in a position to provide the support that they need. But that's just my personal take on this one. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you very much, Orville, for that response and being candid about it as well. Karen, could you respond to that very same question?
Yeah, I would emphasize very similar things, although I would add perhaps two other elements. One is, before we get to the climate COP, there is potential we're going to have a biodiversity COP, and that is focusing on the new targets for biodiversity conservation through to 2030. The meeting is supposed to be happening in Kunming in October. And I think if the Caribbean could get behind the scientifically based target of protecting at least 30% of land and sea by 2030, we set a biodiversity conservation target for the planet and for the world as well. And Caribbean voices could be incredibly large in that space. So that's one thing. I think second, of course, is in the ocean space. We don't really talk about SIDS as much, small island developing states, as we talk about big ocean states, and the value and the heft that these big ocean states can bring to the table because of the critical role that they play in ocean real estate, but also because of the critical dependencies that there are for communities in small island states or big ocean states and developing countries and healthy ecosystems. And so I think we need to activate around that now. That resource mobilization target, I think I have to agree with everything that Orville said. Maybe what we need to see is some interesting collaborations between the private sector and some of the SIDS and LDCs getting together, perhaps private sector asset managers and investors, and sitting down and saying, we need these resources to be mobilized now. How do we do this? How do we get beyond verbal commitments and to looking at how we can activate into the space and take this forward, because we don't have any time to lose, so that by the time we get to Glasgow, we can see concerted effort for cross-sector collaboration, maybe a new type of multilateralism that drives things forward, and that we can then, really push the developed countries that need as well to put up the funds to drive forward investment into the space. So there has to be all of that, and perhaps the Caribbean can step up and cross some of those lines to help drive past the current impasse, so that we can move things forward exponentially in Glasgow.
Excellent response, Karen. Thanks so much for sharing those thoughts. Jake, you have a perspective on issues related to the conference coming up on climate change, and what should we be focusing on?
I think oftentimes from the private sector perspective, these conferences tend to not reach the audience very well. If there's some participation, it seems to be somewhat limited, and it doesn't often materialize into concrete changes in business programs. So I think, the more the private sector is integrated into some of these larger conferences and the COP for biodiversity that Karen mentioned and climate change, I think, it just often the speed of business, the challenges that businesses are facing, particularly in the tourism sector, doesn't often allow for a lot of reflection and projections into the future. And I think the more that some of these conferences can bring information, bring ideas, and bring concrete examples that can be applied relatively in short order, I think is far easier to integrate into the private sector. I think often these targets and timetables that are set don't correlate with the speed of business, the way things change, how rapidly we're having to adapt to some of these challenges. And I think, sometimes the conversations stay at a high state level and don't necessarily materialize in ways that the private sector can act on. So I think, I don't know exactly what the solution is to that. I know, I've been to the most recent COP for biodiversity, and I've been involved in some of the other conferences, and it seems that much of the conversations happen at such a level that it's not being integrated into a great number of companies. So I don't know the exact solution to that. But again, I fall back to the thought I had earlier on this sort of getting green infrastructure and hybrid green, gray infrastructure to be more of the norm. We need examples. We need concrete examples around the region. We need things that we can point to that worked or didn't work. And we need to counterbalance the great number of gray projects that exist and try and come up with new models that can be compared and shown that to be as competitive, functional, cost effective, and perhaps more resilient in time. So I think that is going to be the key to engage the private sector. I think it's a very example driven sector. I think often, we talk about CEOs being leaders, but often CEOs are followers. They're watching what their colleagues and their competitors are doing, and they're learning and adapting to that. And I think we've seen that in the way that many hotel chains and hotels have responded to a lot of the action against single-use plastics and disposable products. So much of that is driven just by following what's happening from other companies and other hotels and other properties. So I think we need just as many examples of positive actions as we can find, and that'll require some experimentation, and it will require some innovative sources of funding that don't exclusively rely on the private sector to take on all of the risk.
Thank you very much, Jake, for that response. Certainly, as we move to wrap up, we have just a minute or so left before we close. It has been such a very rich discussion, but there is one question that I will pose and ask you to include in your wrap-up statements. And this question, extremely relevant. How are we assuring that climate investments get to the level of community? And it's a big question because many of these things are addressing sort of high up. So as you make your closing statements, could you please sort of respond to that as well? And if we can start with Karen.
I'm keeping it very, very short here. If communities are not involved from the very start in developing these projects, the projects will not be sustainable and they will not work. We absolutely need to incorporate the knowledge of communities, their integration and their engagement, and we need to remember to do that at every step of the way. Thank you so much for the opportunity to participate today.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Karen. And Orville, could I go to you with that question in your wrap-up statement?
Sure. Thanks, Joth. I don't even think that there's anything more to say than what Karen said. I'm in total agreement with her. What I'll say is that from the GCF perspective, we do have funding windows which target low-risk projects which you expect to be implemented at a community level. So therefore, communities have to be on board. We've seen a few countries in the region that have identified entities to be nominated for accreditation that are coming in specifically to support community-led initiatives. And we do have a few windows that are going up to $10 million that can facilitate those type of projects. So I would encourage community groups and other stakeholders to put pressure on countries and their representatives to ensure that they are a part of the conversation that's taking place, and that the prioritization of projects, their viewpoint is a part of those processes, because otherwise, as Karen said, these projects will not be successful. And we have seen too many of those in our lifetime.
Thanks very much for that, Orville. Very, very well put. And Jake, to close on you.
I think so much of what we're doing is sort of expanding the pie. I think that's the whole idea of this conference, is looking for innovative ways to finance conservation and nature protection goals. And I think, we've talked a lot about this sort of green infrastructure idea, but the idea that we can look at where a lot of the funding is headed now in terms of recovery, in terms of mitigating disasters, relief, and try and find ways to carve some of that, some of those resources into preventative measures, into conservation measures, into ecosystem-based adaptation measures. And I think we're going to need some, pioneers and some groups willing to take some risk to do that and try out these new models. And I think the more we can have examples like the Mesoamerican reef, the more we can show new ways of changing the way we are operating and protecting, these coastal resources and creating new mechanisms. I think that's what's going to get us there faster, because currently the amount of available resources is frankly just not even remotely enough. And we're talking orders of magnitude in order to really protect some of these resources. So we've got to continue to look at this from a financial perspective and come up with new models. And I think that's why this conference and this webinar is so important and relevant to the conversation. And I think the more we can get governments that are increasingly being impacted by the effects of storm events and flooding events and fires and other natural disasters related to climate, the better off we're going to be. And likewise with local communities and with private sector as well. So I think this is a timely conversation. I'm honored to have been able to participate.
Thank you very much, Jake. And, we have run out of time. I need to wrap up. I just would like to say thanks to the three panelists who joined us, Karen, Jake, and Orville, for, very insightful comments and contributions. I'm sure we could have consumed easily another hour and a half on this discussion. But thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And thanks to all the participants who have joined the session today. On that, I will close. Thanks again.